Let's start like this. You know, it's interesting. A lot of my shows that we do, we always start off with this sound.
We're back.
And obviously that is former Texas quarterback that says that we're back. And it's been a big thing in college football for a lot of things. The ultimate question here is Texas really back? What do they do? What do they look like in the SEC? Can they make the move from the Big 12? The dominance that they had last year under Steve Sarkisian, getting and winning the Big 12, getting to the playoff, really playing really hard and tough against a Washington team that made it to the national title. What is the expectation from the University of Texas this year under Steve Sarkisian? Listen, let me start off with this. I do think that Texas, when we talk about them in their first year in the SEC, they have a very favorable schedule. They open up the season with Colorado State. They do go to the Big House, which I do think is a tough game. But when you talk about the teams and everybody that they are playing, okay, in the beginning of all this, or the beginning of the season, you got UTSA, UL Monroe, Oklahoma, which is going to be a tough game, a big rivalry game, and Georgia. So the first part of Texas's schedule is easily the toughest part, even though they play ULM, UTSA, and Colorado State, because they have Michigan, Oklahoma, Georgia. After that, they do not play a lot of tough opponents. Look, they have Vandy, or they go to Nashville, they go to Vandy, they got Florida, at Arkansas. We'll talk about Sam Pittman and the Razorbacks here a little bit later. Kentucky and A&M. Maybe the A&M game is tough because that's a bitter rival. You haven't played them in over a decade. You're going to College Station. That might be a tough one. The question has always been, how does Texas get through week to week in the SEC? Well, the problem with this is I don't know if they don't get through the SEC very favorably considering what their schedule is. Now, again, the first part of their schedule, even when they play three G5 opponents, it still is the toughest part of their schedule. They don't have the gauntlet necessarily that maybe a South Carolina has. Look, they don't play an LSU and an Ole Miss. They don't have to play an Alabama again. The toughest SEC game that they have this year, outside of their bitter rival in Oklahoma, is going to be the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, they play host to the team who arguably is running the conference right now with Kirby Smart and the Dogs. That is going to be their big key test. Can they knock off arguably the top dog in the SEC when they come to town after they play Oklahoma and Dallas? The question is not if I think that Texas is going to make the playoff. It's, do they slip up against any of these teams in the later part of their schedule? I don't know if I see a world that they slip up to a Vandy or a Florida or an Arkansas, Kentucky. Maybe Kentucky can be a trap game, but that game's at home. I just don't see it. And you got at A&M. Here's what I do think, though, is something that I'm going to obviously talk about and keep my mind on, even going into the season with Texas. The last 2 years, their quarterback, Quinn Ewers, has been hurt. Obviously, last year, he got a little nicked up, was able to come back and played pretty well. The year before in the Alabama game, he gets hurt. It takes him a while to come back. He's a little erratic when he does come back. But we have not seen a year in the Big 12 where he has not been injured, where he's not been hurt. And my question is, from start to finish, from Colorado State to Texas A&M, can Quinn Ewers stay healthy through the entire year in his first year of the SEC? God forbid if he were to go down again, is Arch Manning ready to take the reins over for Quinn Ewers? You know, look, I think it wouldn't be fair to Arch Manning. He's one of the most polarizing players in college football right now, and he hasn't really even thrown 50 passes in college football. He hasn't really even done anything. But he's going to have to be ready, because if you're going to tell me that we have the last 2 years of Quinn Ewers being hurt, what's to lead me to say that that won't happen to him again in the SEC? Quinn Ewers in Texas could get through all of this and get through a Big 10 schedule or Big 12 schedule, like they did last year when Quinn Ewers went down. I'm not 1,000% sure that they could do that in the SEC, even playing a team like Florida, even playing a team like Kentucky. Now, Vanderbilt, it is what it is, and I don't think Arch Manning is as bad as some put him out, but I certainly don't think he's as great right now as some believe him to be. Like, I remember when Quinn Ewers went down and they had struggles, meaning Texas, against Houston, with what might be a better overall team last year than they could have in this one. You can't play like you did against Houston last year or Kansas last year in the SEC because a team like Florida will clip you. A team like Kentucky will clip you. I'm going to just tell you what it is. A team like Arkansas will clip you. You cannot do that, especially when you're going to a rowdy place like Arkansas. I don't know if Sam Pittman will be there as the head coach, but Bobby Petrino could, and you never know what can happen there. I've seen a lot of Texas fans saying that they're going to come into this conference and run it and do big things. I don't know if they run it, but I do think that they're going to be highly competitive. The one thing that I will say about this upcoming year, if you have some of the same things that happen, like Quinn Ewers going down, having some injury in key places that you just can't have in the SEC. Right now on paper, you look and say, man, Kentucky can't beat us. Man, Arkansas can't beat us. Man, Florida can't beat us. That's how teams in the SEC get beat every year. That's how teams like Tennessee a couple of years ago, LSU, A&M, Arkansas, Florida, pretty much every team not named Georgia and Alabama the last couple of years. That's how teams who think that they have really good programs get clipped in this conference and get clipped in this league. And like, man, we lost a game that we're not supposed to. The issue with that, though, is if they lose one of those games, it's not as deadly as it once was, right? Because you have the 12-team playoff. I just think it's very interesting to me to see how they do in a better overall conference. But I look at what they've added. Okay, I think that Texas, for what it's worth, added some really good pieces. They added 3 really good receivers. They add Silas Bolden from Oregon State, who had 54 catches for 746 yards a year ago, and also got some rushes at Oregon State, and a team that did not throw the ball around a lot. They go and get Isaiah Bond from Alabama, who, quite honestly, down the stretch of the season, was their biggest weapon in the passing game. You remember the play against Auburn. You remember the 2 plays, the massive plays that he made against Georgia in the SEC championship game, and what I believe was the catalyst at putting them over the top against Georgia in that SEC championship game. You had Matthew Golden from Houston, who has had 38 catches the last 2 years, hadn't been in a very peculiar situation with Dana Holgorsen at Houston, but had 584 yards 2 years ago and then 404 yards last year, and had 7 touchdowns and 6 this past year, or said 7 touchdowns in 2022 and 6 touchdowns this past year in 23. The question for Texas, will be this. How do they look up front defensively? Now, you got guys like Hill returning. You add a perennial 5-star and a guy like Colin Simmons, who will be a pass rush specialist. But the biggest thing that Texas did this entire offseason, beyond giving an extension to Steve Sarkisian, was getting Trey Moore from UTSA. Trey Moore has been a TFL machine. He has 35.5 tackles for loss in the last 2 years at UTSA. Last year, he had 14 sacks, and then the year before that, he had 8. The question becomes, does a guy like Trey Moore have the type of success in the SEC like he did at UTSA? Now, he doesn't have to face guys like Will Campbell, who is the number 1 or probably and arguably the best tackle in the SEC, if not the country, which Pro Football Focus put Will Campbell as number 1. I mean, he faces maybe, Arkansas, Nando Carmona, who will probably play left tackle for Arkansas. Yet maybe, you're going up against a good O-line in Georgia Oklahoma has some decent pieces. I mean, I don't know if Trey Moore doesn't come into the SEC and do some really good things. I don't think he plays in that gauntlet like maybe some believe that he would. Overall, for the University of Texas, I'll just say this. I think that they are, on paper, coming into this. You bring back a fifth-year quarterback in Quinn Ewers. You bring back a really good offensive line. You got a really good tackle in Banks. You've recruited well at receiver. You've gone into the portal and added some really good pieces on at wide receiver. You got some really good backs. You have a really good backup quarterback with a high-profile name. You do have some DBs, okay, that I do think have played well. But I will tell you this. The biggest concern, if I am a Texas fan, and look, I'm gonna hear this in the comment section. The biggest concern that I would have for Texas is what they have in the secondary and what they have returning along the interior of their defensive line. Now, I know that they have recruited well. They went in the portal and got some guys as well in the interior. But, man, it's a different beast and animal when you come into this league week in and week out. If you give up that many passing yards in the SEC to some of these teams, like if you let Carson Beck go off against you and your secondary plays a lot like they did last year, and I understand that you had a lot of young guys that were in that secondary, Georgia's going to pick you apart. I know that people make fun of Billy Napier in Florida. Go ahead and let your secondary play that bad like they did a year ago in the Big 12, I might add, and Graham Mertz is going to light you up. He did that against really, really good SEC defenses last year. I mean, this is not the same. This is not the same conference that you've been in the last year. You cannot week in and week out. Well, Blake, we beat Alabama. Okay, that sounds great. Fantastic for you. In a 1 week scenario, sounds good. But man, I tell you, you got Oklahoma that I know you want some revenge on. You got Georgia. You better buckle up because this conference isn't easy. And anybody says otherwise is fooling themselves. To wrap this segment up, I'll just say